The Japanese campaign in Malaya 1941-42. Prelude. Japanese preparation and planning. Up until 1940, the Japanese government had been trying to avoid a conflict with the Western powers. But by 1941, they started seeing that as inevitable, and so started planning for it. The reason for the Japanese offensive against the Indochina Peninsula was to access the resources they needed for its industry and army. Capturing these countries and other offensives in the Pacific would also create a buffer between the Japanese mainland and its enemies, the Allies, USA and Great Britain. The greatest threat in the area of Indochina was the British naval base at Singapore and the British forces in Malaya. Malaya was also a country rich in resources, so it was a double benefit to capture the country for the Japanese. They would both eliminate a threat and have access to additional resources. In January 1941, they created the Taiwan Army Research Section led by Colonel Tsuji to research and come up with suggestions for jungle warfare. Contrary to common belief, the Japanese army was not proficient in jungle warfare, as they had been fighting mostly in Manchuria, which was cold weather fighting, and in China, which didn't have a pure jungle or tropical climate. The group created a pamphlet to hand out to the soldiers regarding jungle warfare, and they came up with several key points regarding Malaya and Singapore. First, Singapore had strong defenses towards the sea, but they were weak on the land side. Second, the strong RAF presence in the area was mostly propaganda. Third, most of the troops in the area were of low quality. By the 6th of September, the decision to invade Malaya had been made. They would create the 25th Army, which would be led by General Yamashita. He was offered 6 divisions for the attack, but decided that 3 would be the maximum strength he could support for the offensive. The divisions would be the 5th, 18th and the Imperial Guard Division. At the same time, the 15th Japanese Army would attack Thailand. The whole operation was divided into 5 phases. First, attack Singora and Patani in Thailand and Kota Baru in Malaya at the same time. Second, capture enemy airfields in southern Thailand and northern Malaya. Third, capture Kuala Lumpur in Malaya. Fourth, capture Johor Bahru. Fifth, capture Singapore. It would have to be a swift campaign, utilizing combined arms warfare. Because of the jungle conditions, most fighting would necessarily be fought in and around the roads. A large amount of bicycles would be issued to negate blown bridges, as they could simply wade with the bicycles over streams, where trucks would be stopped. Bicycles didn't require any extra food as horses would, and it would allow the soldiers to carry up to twice the load a marching soldier could carry. It also helped to keep up the tempo and avoided wearing down soldiers as quick as marching would. The Japanese would not contain their actions purely to the roads. When possible, they would flank the enemy through the jungle. All in all, 12,000 bicycles would be issued during the campaign. In total, the Japanese had some 70,000 men for this operation. British plans. The Gibraltar in the Orient they had dubbed Singapore, and it was a naval base that had been modernized in the 30s for a staggering £60 million, having a big dry dock, big naval guns protecting the base from the sea. However, lacking was an adequate defense against a land attack. Up until 1937, it was assumed that the land attack could not be sustained, and a large air force did not need to be stationed there permanently. It could be sent from Europe if needed. Major General Dobby did an assessment and concluded that a force could indeed land and attack over land, and he also identified probable landing sites, like Kota Baru. £60,000 were allotted to improve the Singapore land defenses. A measly 0.1% they had spent on the naval base and its protection from the sea. A strong air force was needed, at least 350 modern aircraft. So RAF started building bases in the area without getting any input from the army, who would be tasked with defending them. General Percival was appointed in overall command in April 1941. He had served with distinction during World War I and had been the Chief of Staff to General Dobby in 1937, doing the study regarding the feasibility of Japanese attack of Malaya from the north, and concluded that it was indeed possible. 1941, the Japanese took over French Indochina, and now an air force of 500 plus planes were the number needed to defend Malaya. The problem was the previous 350 planes needed had not been delivered. Instead, they had some 88 mostly obsolete planes. That number would be around 180 planes by December. Only 25% of them were considered modern. As the British had concluded what landing sites were most likely to be used by the Japanese, they created Operation Matador. Operation Matador was an attempt to attack, contain any Japanese landing directly on the beaches. A British force would launch an attack against Songa as soon as war broke out, or Thailand invited them, Thailand being neutral. However, the force needed for the operation was lacking, so a scaled-down version was created with similar aims as the original one: attack and contain any Japanese landing. This task fell to the 11th Indian Division, who was also tasked with defending Jitra. The main plan for Malaya and Singapore was to hold out 90 to 180 days before the main fleet could arrive. The army would need to protect the newly built air bases all over the country and fight a delaying action. They envisaged the fighting mainly taking place on the roads, so this is what they trained for. The numerical superiority in men was somewhat negated by the fact that it was a mixed force, with some units having been in Malaya since 1936, others were newly arrived. Some were good, others lacked equipment and training. None of the forces really trained for jungle warfare. On paper, they had about 4 divisions to defend the country. However, some 15,000 of those were handling logistics. More troops would be added as the battles took place. The Battle of Malaya starts. 6th of December, the 11th Indian Division is alerted of the possibility to launch Operation Matador. They moved to the Jitra defensive line. 8th of December, 12:30, the Japanese 5th Division lands at Kota Baru, which is defended by the 8th Infantry Brigade. The defenses at the beach are substantial, with mines, barbed wire and pillboxes. British artillery hits the landing crafts, while Japanese Navy fires heavy salvos at the beach defenses. By 1 o'clock, 2 British pillboxes have been captured. British planes flying from Kota Baru airfield hits the Japanese Navy, sinking 1 ship and damaging 2 others. Japanese airplanes will attack the airfield. More than half of the 110 British planes deployed in the northern Malaya have been disabled by the 9th of December. Japanese planes will continue to hit British air bases all during the campaign. At the beach, British forces launches a counterattack with 1 company at Sabka Beach, managing to reach one of the surrounded pillboxes, but not the second one. Japanese forces had landed more troops and threatens to flank the company. It pulls back with heavy casualties. By the 9th of December, the airfield at Kota Baru are in Japanese hands, and the British forces starts retreating south. Bad communications indicates substantial losses, but as groups of soldiers reaches the new British line, it turns out the losses have not been as bad as expected. The airbase at Kota Baru had been abandoned. They destroyed the buildings and some supplies, but they left fuel, bombs, and the runway intact for the Japanese, who now had an airfield in Malaya to operate from. Demise of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The only substantial naval force at Singapore were HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. Good ships that could do a lot of damage if they had air cover. On the 8th of December, the ship sails from Singapore to try and disrupt the Japanese naval landing at Kota Baru. By the 9th of December, the force is informed that they will have no air cover. Information about a possible Japanese landing at Kuantan. By this time, the force has been spotted several times by Japanese submarines. 10th of December. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes attack, and by 1 o'clock both ships have been sunk, removing any naval threat to the Japanese Navy. The Battle of Jitra. The 11th Indian Division takes up its position at Jitra. The defenses are not ready, mines are not placed, and trenches are waterlogged. The commander of the 11th Indian Division puts his 6th Indian Brigade on the left and the 15th Indian Brigade on the right, with the 28th Indian Brigade in reserve. Realizing how bad the defenses are, he orders 2 battalions to delay the enemy to give more time to improve the main line. The 2 battalions manage a couple of successful ambushes, but as 1 battalion is loading into trucks, they are overrun by Japanese tanks and the battalion is mostly destroyed. The 2nd battalion, lacking anti-tank guns, manages to halt the Japanese on a bridge, but the Japanese infantry cross the river on either side and exposes their flank. The inexperienced battalion will break. 11th to 13th of December. The line at Jitra is still not finished, and Japanese forces threatens to envelop from the south at Kro. So Commander David Murray Lyon requests to pull back to Gurun, but that is denied by the commanding General Percival. Detachment Seki from the 5th Japanese Division runs into the main defensive line of the 11th Indian Division. They attack but are repulsed. Saiki realized that this is the main defensive line and not a rear guard unit. While General Kwamura prepares to attack with 2 regiments, Saiki launches another attack and manages to push the defenders back, creating a wedge in the British defenses. 12th of December. Murray Lyon again asks permissions to pull back, which is now granted. Because of poor communication, the order to fall back does not reach all troops, and stores are left intact for the Japanese, who starts calling them Churchill stores. The 11th Indian Division have lost around 3,000 men. Meanwhile, the Japanese have again attacked British airfields, and General Percival orders the remaining aircraft back to Singapore. 14th, 15th of December. The 11th Indian Division pulls back to Gurun. The position is a strong one, but 1 battalion of Japanese infantry with tank easily breaks through the defenses, and the division again have to pull back. Eastern Malaya. The 9th Indian Division is defending Eastern Malaya. The 8th Brigade had been forced back by the 18th Japanese Division from Kota Baru. They pull back, leaving Gongkeda and Mekang airfield. Bad roads, difficult terrain slows down the Japanese 18th Division, and they only reach Kuantan on the 30th of December, which is defended by the 9th Indian Division. Heavy fighting takes place until the 2nd of January, when the retreat of the 11th Indian Division on the western side forces the 9th Indian Division to also pull back. Kampar, 30th of December to 2nd of January. Trying to halt the Japanese advance, the 11th Indian Division makes a stand at a strong position around Kampar village. The amalgamated 16th and 15th Brigade will hold the main road, the 28th Brigade the eastern flank. Facing them are the 5th Japanese Division and part of the Imperial Guard Division. The 30th of December, the Japanese force launches their attack, but it is repulsed, and they have some problem holding against a British counterattack. 1st of January. The Japanese 41st Regiment attacked the main defenses and starts outflanking the defense to the east of the village. The 42nd Regiment manages to push to the western flank through some swamps, making some headway. Meanwhile, the 11th Regiment makes a successful landing at Uta Melinta, where British forces are forced to fall back towards Telok Anson. The Japanese Imperial Guard Division attacks Telok Anson, and the British forces again falls back towards the Slim River. The rest of the 11th Indian Division, now threatened to be cut off, also pulls back to the Slim River. Japanese forces tries another landing at Kuala Selangor, but it fails as the British now had reinforced the beach defenses. Battle at the Slim River. 11th Indian Division is now holding the river defenses. The soldiers are exhausted. They lack anti-tank guns. And the dense jungle here means that the Japanese can only attack down the road and the railway. On the 7th of January, the Japanese attack with tanks and infantry, pushing through several defensive lines and managing to capture the bridge intact. Heavy British artillery then stops the advance, but a counterattack fails to recapture the bridge. Japanese forces crosses the river and the 11th Indian Division falls back with heavy casualties. Battle at Moar. The 11th Indian Division is now so depleted it has to pull back past the Moar River, leaving the capital Kuala Lumpur and the supplies there for the Japanese, who captures the city on the 11th of January. At Moar, the Australian 8th Division holds the line, which also commands the 9th Indian Division. The 45th Indian Brigade, poorly trained, is tasked to hold the coast and the western part of the river. At Gemas, the 8th Indian Brigade is located. Ahead of it is the 27th Australian Brigade. At Segemat, the 22nd Indian Brigade. 14th of January. Australian forces ambushed the 5th Japanese Division at Gemeneshe Bridge and inflict several hundred Japanese casualties before they fall back the next day. 15th of January. The 5th Japanese Guard Regiment attacks Moar. In the night between the 15th and 16th of January, they cross the river and the next day attacks the city, capturing it. The 45th Indian Brigade could not hold them back. British reserves are used in an attempt to stop the Japanese forces at Bakri. The 5th Japanese Division tries for 3 days to take Gemas, but fail. On the 18th they instead flank the position, running into the 22nd Indian Brigade. They break their defenses, and by the 19th of January they capture Gemas. Last line before Singapore. The British are now falling back, except the 45th Indian Brigade, which has been all but cut off. All attempts to rescue it fails. Of 4,500 men, only 900 will reach the British lines. The new defense line runs through Kluang down to Batung Pat. However, the amalgamated 1615 Brigade is almost directly threatened to be cut off by the Imperial Guard Division. It tries to withdraw, but the Japanese has cut off their retreat. Some 2,700 men will be evacuated by sea. On the east coast, the 22nd Australian Brigade fights the 18th Japanese Division and executes some well-planned ambushes. General Percival now orders a phased retreat back to Singapore. They leave Johor Bahru on the 31st of January, failing to destroy the large stockpile of supplies, which falls into the Japanese hands. British forces blows up the causeway between Singapore and the mainland, also severing the water supply for the island. Meanwhile, 3 new brigades have arrived, the 44th Indian Brigade on the 22nd of January, and the 53rd, 54th British Brigades on the 29th of January. The fall of Singapore. The Japanese forces are now very low on ammunition and other supplies. They need to capture Singapore fast or they might fail. The British under Percival needs to hold out and wear the Japanese down. But with no effective air force, low morale and bottled up, they face a very bad situation. Between the 1st and the 8th of February, Japanese artillery keeps a steady barrage all over the coast of the island. In the north, the British have deployed the 22nd and 27th Brigades. To the northeast, the 53rd and 54th Brigades, with the 11th Indian Division in the middle. There are some brigades holding the southern part. Percival expects the invasion to come on the northeastern part of the island. On the 8th of February, the Japanese artillery concentrate their artillery on the northwestern part, and during the 9th, the 5th and 18th Japanese Division attacks and manages to land some 4,000 troops on the island by the morning. 9th of February. In the evening, the Imperial Guard Division attacks and captures Kranji, just west of the causeway. The 27th Australian Brigade holds them, but at midnight they decide to pull back, exposing the 11th Indian Division. The 22nd Australian Brigade also pulls back, heading towards the Yorung line. A vague order outlining where they should pull back from that line if needed is taken as an order to pull back, and on the 10th they retreat from the Yorung line. On the 11th, the British tries to counterattack against the 5th and 18th Japanese Division, but it fails. The Imperial Guard Division attacks the 11th Indian Division. Under constant pressure, Percival pulls his troops back to just outside the city. During the 13th and 14th of February, they fight, but by then all the water reservoirs on the island have been captured. The 15th of February, Percival surrenders. The British forces have lost some 140,000 men in casualties and prisoners. The Japanese casualties are around 10,000. War crimes. On the 14th of February, the Alexander Hospital is captured by Japanese soldiers. A British lieutenant with a white flag is bayoneted. Japanese soldiers enter the hospital and kill several patients, staff and nurses. The rest are marched off, kept for 1 day before they are also bayoneted. The campaign have seen several such atrocities against captured soldiers. The prisoners will face hardship, starvation, some killed by sadistic Japanese soldiers. The death toll among POWs can be as high as 30%. The local population, especially the Chinese, would suffer even more. Some figures for Malaya alone would give the death toll to between 40 to 50,000. Conclusion. From a pure military perspective, the Japanese attack and conquest of Malaya is among the most brilliant fought campaigns during World War II. They are just as successful as the British offensive in North Africa that destroyed the Italian Tenth Army, or the German attack and conquest of France. Here, if not in numbers, then at least in tactics. The Japanese used a mobile style of warfare that with its speed stunned the British defenders. They used a force adequate to the task, one which they could supply. They went low-tech and used bicycles, which meant they could keep up a relative high speed and the soldiers could carry more supplies. That also meant that the blown bridges would not stop the advance. They simply waded across the rivers or made simple plank crossings. They studied the terrain and created a research group to advise what was needed to succeed in the dense jungle terrain of Malaya. Being adaptable, they would launch ad hoc landings to the flank of the enemy, always keeping up the pressure, stopping the British forces from gaining time to reorganize. They also managed combined arms warfare in a brilliant way. They were running out of supplies in the end, but they used what they had to great advantage. It was a fast, adaptable, aggressive campaign. The British, on the other hand, did almost all things wrong. They spent too much money on the naval defenses and way too little on the land defenses. They stated what was needed to defend Malaya, especially in number of airplanes, but they were never provided. Instead, they simply stated even more planes were needed. As a naval base, it ended up having only 2 capital ships with no air cover. Even though the British had crippled the Bismarck with aircraft, they still sent out 2 of their capital ships without air cover. They had no general plan for the defense of Malaya or Singapore. The RAF and the army did not collaborate. They lacked tanks and anti-tank weapons. And maybe tanks would have been hard to supply in 1941, but anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft guns could have been supplied. The Japanese were always given the initiative, and the British generals simply waited for them to attack. Communication broke down, and on several occasions they forgot to destroy supply depots they had created. And in one instant, they destroyed all the buildings at an airfield, but left the supply and runways intact. General Arthur Percival was not at fault for the deficiencies of men and material, but he was passive with the force he had. A fortress mentality meant that they hardly ever conducted an aggressive retreat. Instead, mostly they passively waited to see what the Japanese force would do, handing them the initiative. He made several bad calls, but another general with the same force might not have fared any better. The Battle of Jitra should probably not have taken place. Instead, they should have fallen back as the commanding general wanted. Percival thought it would be bad for morale to fall back, but losing would prove to be even worse. The badly executed retreat when they were allowed to pull back did not help the situation. More troops at Muar and more experienced troops holding the left flank could probably have made a difference, especially since they knew that the Japanese forces would attempt to flank or even launch amphibious landings. When they were isolated at Singapore, it was more or less over. Percival's idea that the Japanese would attack in the northeast instead of the northwest was not really anything he could be blamed for, in my opinion. Had they repulsed the initial Japanese attack, the Japanese might have simply run out of supplies, bullets and artillery shells. But considering how the campaign had progressed before, that was probably less likely. Commander Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 25th Japanese Army was a good, highly aggressive and adaptable commander with a realistic view on what could be done. However, he also allowed war crimes to be committed under his command, and he didn't punish the soldiers who committed them. General Arthur Percival was passive, showed no aggressiveness with the force he had. As I said before, not all was his fault, but the general lack of a realistic strategy, underestimating the Japanese, and following the assumption that they would have 180 days until the fleet arrived at Singapore, he could have changed. The front commanders performed less than stellar. Some commanders were good, launched some very damaging ambushes, but they had too little time to really make a difference. What could the British have done differently with the knowledge at hand? As the main strategy was to delay the Japanese, they could have had a few airfields in the north that easily could have been destroyed and prepared to be destroyed. As air power was key, if you don't have it, you have to deny the enemy. The lack of collaboration between the RAF and the army was really something that the commander should have rectified. Using covering forces set ambushes as they prepared the main line somewhere maybe at Kampar and a second line at Muar. Already at Jitra they had managed some successful ambushes, but it's also shown that the main line could not hold, and that should have dictated the actions from then on. The Japanese would have supply problems, so the further they advanced, the weaker they would get. They could have done what Finland did in 1939 with the Soviet Union. They created a cover force to wear down the enemy until it reached their main line. This was already known in 1941. Finland and Malaya had similarities. Both had very difficult terrain and the main fighting had to be in or around the roads. Percival knew his forces was undertrained and under-equipped, so ambushes would have been the key. When they had time to prepare them, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese. However, putting relatively untrained troops against veteran Japanese troops, where they would be the strongest at Jitra, was not a good strategy, and Percival actually did it again and again. It is not certain that this would have made a difference, but Percival knew the weakness of his own forces, and he could see in battle after battle that the main line could simply not hold the Japanese. He underestimated them. So he did not really learn from their successes or their failures. He just kept going on the same strategy he had from the start. This is my video regarding the Malayan campaign. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe, and see you at the next video.